to your talk.
Thank you very much, Carola. So let's see whether I can justify all that upfront praise this morning. So good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. It's awesome to have the chance to talk to all of you, even though it's only digital. I think we'll try to make the most out of it. And to that end, I'm giving a new thing a try, which is called Aha Slides. I believe that some of you may have seen it before, but in case you don't, in case you haven't, Aha Slides actually gives you the opportunity to help me create this presentation. So no just listening and not doing anything this morning for you folks. You'll have to join in, at least that's my hope, and help me drive this thing to the end. So please use your phones to scan that QR code, or if you prefer to use a desktop browser of some kind, just use that URI that you can see there. I can see that 9 people have joined, and you can too. Well, now it's 8, so 1 person has left already. So if you follow that link, you will be able to interact with each individual slide. So you can send me a +1 or leave a little heart, send smileys, send all sorts of reactions. You can also ask questions. So if you'll click on the little question mark down there, you can enter a question. I can't promise that I'll be able to follow all the questions as they're being asked, but we'll definitely address them at the end. And we have lots of interactivity within the presentation so that you can actually help me answer a few of the questions that I'll pose, so then not just rhetorical at the end. So with that said, let's just get right into a technical topic and ask first whether you have used this thing before. So this is your first chance of an interaction. So many of you are using it for the first time. Some of you have used it, maybe even at presentations here. I know that some of my coworkers are also big fans of Aha Slides now. Oh, this is awesome. Lots of people interacting here. This is great. Okay, so on to technology. Let's talk about Phil Collins. So in case you're wondering about why am I asking this, I think there's some analogy here between this person and some of the stuff we'll be talking about later on. Phil Collins has an interesting personal history. He's turned 70 this year, which makes me feel really, really, really old, because I am. And I would like to find out what you think when you think of Phil Collins. So let's start with that first question. When you think of Phil Collins, what do you think of? Now, one of the slide issues with Aha Slides we have here is that I have to bridge about 10 seconds of delay between the video stream and what you're doing when you answer the question. So if it seems that it takes a little for you to answer, that's just because what I'm saying reaches you with a slight delay. So answers are coming in. This is awesome. Okay. So Phil Collins has done a lot of things in his life. So In the Air Tonight is what many people think of as one of his signature songs. Also one of the greatest musicians of a generation, greatest 80s music. I can hear him calling in the air tonight. Lots of music. Don't know his songs. That's kind of obvious. It seems like it should be obvious that everybody knows Phil Collins, but of course that's just because, you know, I grew up with this person and many of you didn't. Live Aid. So Phil Collins was the only person who had two gigs on the famous Live Aid concert. He actually used the Concorde to fly from London to I don't know, New York, whatever, and had two music sessions on that night. He also, and that's an interesting thing, he also was a drummer, right? So people might know that he was the drummer for Genesis when he also sang there, but he also was the drummer for Genesis when he didn't, when Peter Gabriel was the singer. And that, I think, is some of the interesting thing about this particular person. He did lots of things. He created music for Disney movies. And let's see, probably not my favorite. Some people hate Phil Collins with a vengeance because during the 80s, he was probably the most popular person ever. And that brings me to the analogy here. I think that some things, some people, but also some things can become hugely popular at one particular point in time. And then all this popularity can turn into the opposite. Something that everybody loved, that everybody could agree was just great, turned out to be something that yeah, if you like that, then that's kind of embarrassing. And if you admit that you actually like it, you're sort of flipping the bozo bit for many people. So that is those are some of the thoughts I have here. Personally, I'm a big Phil Collins fan. I'm actually a fan of his drumming in the years 1971 to 1977. So that is the good stuff that I see in Phil Collins. And what I'd like to talk to you about is what good can we find in technology that has become unpopular or no longer is as popular as it used to be once. So let's talk a little bit about hype and anti-hype and the associated money making. So my guess is that most of you will be familiar with the Gartner hype cycle curve. This is a pretty famous thing. It's been used and actually overused. You could argue that it has been hyped itself for a long time, and it has this different stages through which technologies go. So something appears, it's very new, nobody knows it. That's the technology trigger. So some new thing gets invented or discovered or starts its rise on this popularity curve. And then it hits the peak of inflated expectations up there. That's when everybody believes this thing is going to cure world hunger and solve everybody's problems. And then it inevitably goes straight down and ends up in this trough disillusionment where everybody thinks, well, yeah, all those expectations were completely overblown, and this was just a stupid thing. We should have never believed in this particular thing. And then it very slowly rises up this slope of enlightenment until it hopefully hits a plateau of productivity, where you actually know what it's useful for, where you know what it can't do, where you know what it can do. And that's sort of the ideal way for technology to become mainstream, so that at some point in time we can handle it without all of these overinflated expectations. Now, that is true, I think, in many regards, in many situations, and it's a common way of viewing things, and I think it's not a bad one, actually. I do think that some things move a little differently along this curve. So that's my first addition here. I think there is this painful decline to irrelevance for a lot of things that, have been too big of a disillusionment for some kind. But sometimes that just, go out of fashion. There's no particular reason that those things are no longer popular. It's not as if they have lost everything that made them appealing once. It's just that for some reason nobody really looks at them anymore. So that is my first thing here. And I think some things go through this for the wrong reasons. And sometimes we throw out the baby with the bathwater. Sometimes we end up not using something anymore, even though there are some good thoughts within that. And that is what I want to discuss with you for the rest of this particular session. There's also an interesting thing, which is that at some point in time, you actually can make money by inverting the hype cycle. So I had a fantastic epiphany about this when I noticed a very well-known speaker do this very strategically, very technically. That was when one of the things we're going to talking about service-oriented architecture was really, really up on this, peak of inflated expectations thing. And he actually said in a ton of presentations, listening to all of that and sort of building up his story. And his story was, use the nagging doubts that people have whenever something becomes too popular, and actually turn that into his own money-making machine, which I think is perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to, address people's expectations and sort of address things that are not addressed enough or well enough by others. So if you move up this slow naysayer slope, right, where things are on the way to becoming a laughingstock, because then it's too late. But as long as they're on the way to becoming a laughingstock, you can actually become a very interesting person to invite, a very interesting person to conduct workshops, a very interesting person to talk about how something is really bad. At some point in time, it becomes so obvious that it's bad, or at least everybody thinks it's now obvious that it's something bad, that this, goes down as well. The anti-hype curve enters the stage where this is just another boring thing, where it's even boring to talk about how it's boring, right? So when that happens, you have lost your ability to make money of that. But I'm not strategically suggesting you make money out of talking badly about things. I'm just saying that you should be aware that there are some people who do. And that is just part of the money-making industry, of our industry as any others as well. Okay, so let's try to take a look at the good in the unfashionable. And I've picked a few things that I think are somewhat unfashionable. I'm actually pretty sure. I might have hit the stage where some of them might have reached the stage where some of you aren't old enough to even know them anymore. But that's okay. It's also interesting. So please feel free at any point in time to enter answers such as, I don't know what this is, never heard of it. That's interesting as well. So with that said, let's start. I tried to come up with a thing here like Tanztafel, which you might know, is just there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And to me, this is like, there is almost nothing that is all bad. So let's try to discover some things, in some good things in some well-known unfashionable disasters. And the first one would be model-driven architecture. I'm almost posing the same three questions. So let's start with that one and talk about what this actually invokes. When you think of model-driven architecture, what do you think of? Let's build a little word cloud. I could have added word clouds at something that has become quite unfashionable as well, but I didn't. That was too meta for my taste. So let's enter some things here and let me know what you think. So I see 99 people coming up here. So code generation. So does nobody know what model-driven architecture is anymore? One way. Okay, so that code generation used to be one way. That's an interesting aspect. Old-fashioned. Oh, that's nice. Of course it's old-fashioned. Not working. I like that. Programming with UML, that is an interesting aspect here. So what we did when we did model-driven architecture, we as an industry, was we built UML models. We'll get to UML in a second. And then we used those UML models to actually produce code that was hard to produce by hand. There was this idea that your model would be more abstract than the actual technology that you used. So you could capture the more abstract requirements, the more abstract design of your solution in a model, and then use some model generation rules to create and adapt that to a specific thing. And there was this thing, I think somebody wrote PIM, the platform independent model, that would then be translated into a platform specific model through various stages of model transformation. And I think we're building up a really nice word cloud here, or you are actually. And this is just my chance to point out that I will share the result as well. So the end result of this presentation will be the presentation, including all of your input. So we will get this little thing here as well. It's also interesting to see other things that are a little more fashionable or a little less out-fashioned these days, like DSLs or domain-driven, which we'll get to as well. So there are some things here. There are also some criticisms, and we will get to some of the reasons why it did not work out that well. So model-driven architecture, this general idea, it used to be dramatically popular. It used to be a really amazing hype. It was probably too long ago for many of you, but it used to be this great hype at one point in time. So why did it become unpopular? I think you mentioned a few of those things in the word cloud part as well, but maybe let's focus on really what were the major problems here. What were the things that made it turn out to not be this fantastically great thing that everybody had expected it to be? It was too static. It's true that it focused way too much on the static aspects of thing, because those were the easier ones to get right. The one-way thing, somebody mentioned that in the word cloud thing as well. So typically it had this, well, let's maybe not call it one way. You used to be able to generate things more than once. Oh, but only in this one direction. You couldn't go back, but you could repeat the whole thing. It was not once. That's what I'm trying to say. It was not an only once solution. It was sometimes too academic. That is absolutely true. There were these huge theoretical ideas about all of those models, and it turned out not to be that viable in practice. UML sucks. You'll have your chance to repeat that a few slides down the road. Generated code changed without changing the model. One of the major pains when you ended up manually changing generated code, you couldn't generate again, and that hurt you very, very much. Expectations did not match reality, something that is always true of those hype things as far as I can tell, or almost always true. It was too complicated. That is also, I think, something that was very much the case in many setups, maybe not all of them. No TDDs. A lot of the magical tools fail to include a lot of the technology progress or the best practices that we have. A lot of these click tools, these visual tools have that problem. So again, fantastic list of things that we have here about what made MDA unpopular. So let's go to the next question. What was good about it? Is there anything in model-driven architecture that was worth saving? Or is it good that nobody talks about it anymore? Now, really think hard. What do you think is a good part of, if you know it, of model-driven architecture? Somebody mentions the forced consistency, and I can see what you're addressing, or I believe I can see what you're addressing here, which is that if you use a model to generate code, then the model and the code actually have a strong relation. They actually match, right? So the model is not documentation. It's not metadata. It is not something that somebody has written about your system. It actually is what your system is created from. So I think that's a strong idea. There's not a lot here that's supposedly good about MDA, right? Okay, focus now. They're coming in. Awesome. So we have a focus on requirements, not technological details. I think that is a very interesting aspect here. You were able, or you were supposed to be able, and often you were, to focus on the domain and not so much on the technical things. When you sort of multiply your domain knowledge with all of the technical decisions, you end up with the actual system that has all of these aspects mixed. And in a way, model-driven architecture was a way to separate those aspects so that you had technical aspects as well as the domain aspects. Don't know, technique from before my career. I love this. You know, I like this saying, so I have to put it in here. I probably have to-do list entries that are older than some of you. So it's natural and totally normal that some of you have never even heard about this thing. But that also is a bit of a symptom. I mean, this used to be something that a lot of people believed in. So why did it become so unpopular, and why can't we save some of the stuff? I think there is a lot that can be saved here. I think the idea of abstraction, of having a more abstract model that you actually use in a machine-readable way, is a very good one. That model doesn't necessarily have to be UML. It can be something else. And of course, whether or not that's a good idea depends on whether it is easier to have this abstract model than to have the actual code. That used to be the case in a lot of MDA scenarios. So that was one of the reasons it was so important. It also has what I think could be labeled this engine approach, where you think of some sort of machinery that allows you to abstract your ideas in a better way. So the machinery in most model-driven architecture projects was a development time machinery. So it allowed you to develop on a higher abstraction level than you used to be able to develop when you didn't use that stuff. So this idea of building a machine, whether it's a runtime machine or a development time machine, that allows you to express your domain model, the solution to your domain problems in a more abstract way, is, I think, a very good one. So even if you use something that interprets a model instead of maybe generating code from it, I think you're reusing some of the ideas. What was also very nice about model-driven architecture was this idea of actually viewing the solution that you were building as something that you could interpret as data as well. And I remember that about 25 years ago, I wrote an article, or no, 20 years ago probably, I wrote an article of what I liked about MDA, and somebody wrote in Lambda the Ultimate, if you remember that little website, somebody wrote, "Oh, nice, another Java dude discovered Lisp macros," which was a fantastic thing. I could have added Lisp as a technology here as well, but I didn't. Okay, so thank you very much for participating in this one. So let's move right on to the next one, UML. We hit on some of that already, so let's dive right in and build that little UML word cloud. So again, please let me know what it is that UML makes you think of. I think model-driven architecture would be an obvious choice here, and hopefully somebody has that. So what else is it? And I need to find a good way to bridge those few seconds for the next time I use AHA slides. So let's see what we can do with that. Oh, complexity. That's a good one. So classes, relationships, methods. So we're at the heart of object orientation here, right? So UML has all of these constructs and allows us to do something with that. Academic, that is an interesting thing. So UML had, at some point in time, had turned pretty academic, even though it was never driven by universities or researchers. It was always an industry standard. A standard language, somebody has mentioned that here. Static and dynamic models, also an interesting thing. Visualization is, of course, at the heart of it. It was a visual language, or it is a visual language. Of course, it's still there. Old-fashioned, somebody mentioned it. So people think that that people building UML models are a little stuck in the last century, or at least the last decade. Somebody mentioned it's a well-defined standard. Okay, so we have a lot of things that we all, I think, or many of you know about UML. And in the same spirit as last time, let's talk about why did it become unpopular? What made UML unfashionable? Because probably, I think we can agree that it's no longer fashionable, that you don't win fashion prizes for mentioning that you use UML. So what made it so hard for UML? Too formal. I think we had that on the last slide as well, right? So it's a formalized language, which means that you have to adhere to those rules, at least if you want to build a correct UML model. Expectations did not match reality. Excellent. So you can reuse that obviously everywhere. So it's true, it was oversold. There was a lot of a promise that was not delivered. It was not colored. I'm not sure that's true. There were actually case tools that allowed you to use color. There was even a book called UML in Color that advocated for using color to make your models more expressive. It gets stale fast. That's a little related to the model-driven architecture discussion, right? If it's metadata, if it's data about your system, as opposed to something that you generate your system from, that's pretty hard. It's associated with big design up front. That, I think, is a very, very strong argument. Doesn't really matter whether it's true that you could only use UML when you do big design up front. That's what it's become associated with, which is kind of interesting because many of the UML advocates are also were also part of the initial Agile community. So a lot of things about UML that contributed to it becoming unpopular. So what was good about it? I think some of the things were mentioned as well. So I'll mention one that you'll write there, which is that it was a standard language. And that to me is probably a strong argument for still maintaining parts of UML. Somebody mentioned that parts of it were useful, which I also think is very nice, damning with faint praise. It grew too big, but it had interesting aspects. It has some diagrams that are still, some diagram types that are still pretty awesome. Like sequence diagrams, that's a very good thing here. I would add state charts, status diagrams as well, because they're extremely helpful. They weren't invented for UML, they just happened to become part of it. A standard, everybody knows it. Is that true? Does everybody? I actually think everybody knows a bit of it, because if I draw a class diagram, most of you will recognize an inheritance symbol there. So there is some shared common knowledge. It has become part of our jargon. Sorry, switched to the wrong slide too early. It has become part of our jargon. And I do think that every time we use a visual language that is not standardized, we lose a little. We build something, but we have to explain what it is. We have to explain, what do these lines mean? We lose some sort of expressiveness here. Now, I'm not a big fan of all of UML because I do think it's way too complicated. It's become way too big for its own good. But there are still some useful things in it, and I still think it should be part of the tool set, part of the things that we should use in our day-to-day architect's life. Not as our only tool, of course, because that will be a very sad architect's life, but as one useful tool that we can adapt in certain situations. So let's talk about this last thing here in my little list, which is service-oriented architecture. Again, fire away. Let's build the SOA Word Cloud. Oh, Word Cloud. It's fine as well. So what is it that that you think of? Oh, that's a good one. ESBs. So I could have made that its own hype, right? So enterprise service buses at some point in time used to be extremely popular. In fact, they came a little after SOA had been introduced, and they sort of became the vendorization of WS Death Star. So that's a good one as well. It's a term, I think, coined by the Ruby on Rails inventor David Heinemann Hansen to talk about all of those standards there. Bloatware, I see somebody has experience with SOA tools. There was a lot of very, very bad tooling around this thing. SOAP used to be a very popular standard. It's now, almost completely legacy. There's almost nothing new being built on SOAP, which is really kind of funny because I remember having to defend not wanting to use SOAP or not considering SOAP the greatest thing on earth for a long time. You could argue that I wrote the anti-SOA hype curve right after I wrote the SOA hype curve. So I made a career of both its ways up and its way back down. There were a lot of consultants. So SOA was fantastic if you were a consultant. You could spend days talking about all of those standards. So SOA, in essence, though, was this idea of having services that created boundaries between consumers and providers so that you had some logic that you could invoke that was sitting behind an API that was networked in some way. And if that reminds you of something that is currently fashionable, that is not a coincidence. So again, let's go to the next thing. Why did it become unpopular? Why did people start to hate SOA so much? I think a lot of the things were mentioned on the word cloud thing, which is now I see becoming a pattern here, right? So it's hard to ask of what makes it what does it make you think of without all of the negative things coming out. So I'll merge these two slides the next time I do this kind of presentation. So it was replaced by a new hype. I like that, and we'll get to that. It was not domain-driven. That is an interesting one. I would love to talk to the person who wrote that. Maybe you can put a question there, or we can address it at the end. It was not agile enough. A lot of the bloatware, a lot of the heavy infrastructure led to things become a lot slower than they were supposed to be, even though it was supposed to be a way to become faster. Vendor lock-in, or in general, vendors were part of a problem here, right? REST became more popular than many of the WS Death Star technologies here. And you could argue that REST is another way of doing SOA, or you could argue that it's an alternative to SOA. That depends on how you define it, which I would argue was also one of the downsides of SOA. It was never really well defined, right? So let's talk about what's good about SOA. What are the things that we should save from there? So what is a reasonable thing we could do here? I think the idea of having a boundary is a good thing. Decoupling is something that comes with that boundary, right? So we have looser coupling or less tightly coupled systems. We do that. Somebody mentions the WS Star standards in a positive way. I wouldn't do that, but it's okay to disagree sometimes. We have this whole idea of service orientation. So the most abstract concept in there is that you can extract something out of this system into a reusable or usable or isolated part and implement it in whatever way you think is reasonable. And then you can actually build up a landscape or a portfolio of services that can be used and reused. This general idea is not all bad, even though the reuse aspect is maybe not as important as it used to be or as people believed it to be in the past. So the idea of isolating things, I think, is a good one. I think if you look at real world problems, then the fact that it's too easy to just call into stuff, right? That it's too easy to create a coupling between two things is what leads us to those monolithic big systems that create so many problems for our daily lives. So the idea of having a network boundary that's harder to cross is actually an interesting thing. And in fact, I wrote an article, again, I keep repeating myself, it's a little boring. That's what happens when old men yell at the cloud. So I wrote an article, again, 15 years ago or 10 years ago, I can't remember, that was about service orientation that you could easily reuse today to talk about microservices. So with that said, I think there are a ton of other things that have the same thing. So we can spend a little time here just collecting things for maybe the next presentation of this kind. What other anti-hypes would be interesting? What things should we look at and figure out what's good in them or what was good in them? Maybe we can spend a bit of time with that. I made this collection of 3 things because I wanted to find 3 things that were really, really highly unpopular. So microservices, that's an interesting one, and Kubernetes is also an interesting one. And you will see why I find them both interesting. Blockchain, I think that is fantastic. I considered it, but I think it merits its own presentation. Just the hype and anti-hype. Actually, I think in the blockchain space is the one space where those 2 hype cycles occurred at the same time, which I think is really something that I haven't seen before. Typically, it takes a while for something to be overhyped before the anti-hype starts. And at this particular thing, I think both are equally strong. So thank you for this collection. That is a very great thing. Serverless also nice. Okay, so let's look at some of those things because I thought it might be nice to spend looking a little bit into the future and asking ourselves what will happen to those things that are very popular right now. So let's talk about single-page applications. Single-page applications are obviously the only way to build web applications these days. There is no other way we could possibly do that. So I would be interested in finding out what are some of the anti-SPA arguments. So while I have the 10-second delay, I can briefly explain to those who don't know what a single-page application is, right? A single-page application is an application where instead of HTML being rendered on the server and then sent to the browser, what's sent to the browser is essentially a very small HTML page, just including a link to a JavaScript application. And then the JavaScript application will be executed in the browser, and it'll take care of creating the HTML. That's a gross oversimplification, but I want to make the point that the generation of the HTML, the actual creation of what the browser sees as a user interface, happens in the client as opposed to the server. Now, there's a lot of wonderful anti-SPA arguments here, and I think there's a lot of truth to them, even though it's a little unfair that I didn't give the SPA fans a chance, or I won't give the SPA fans a chance to add all the hype arguments. But I frankly don't think single-page applications need any more hype at the moment. So find those arguments yourself. I won't help you do that. So it's an interesting thing here that we see a lot of arguments about slow and complex. And those things seem to reoccur again and again with a lot of anti-hype. So some things seem like a very, very good idea until we reassess the cost-benefit relation, right? So I think we're now much more aware of the costs that single-page applications have, and we're comparing that differently to the usefulness or to the benefits that we get from them that we did in the past. Awesome, thank you very much. Let's look at the next one. You mentioned it. I'm not that quick at creating slides, so I didn't create that slide just because you mentioned it, but I think it's sort of an obvious thing, right? I have been in this industry for a while now. I have never ever seen anything as hyped as microservices. I've never seen a hype that was that successful. Now, for that reason, we're going to do it a little differently here, also to give you a chance to look at more aha slides features, because that's such a cool product. So we're going to do a little voting here. Talk to me about what is bad about microservices. That'll be stage 1. So just add your thoughts here. What's bad of them? Okay, things are coming in. I like that a lot. Very good. So unnecessary increase of complexity. Again, same pattern here, right? First law of distributed systems, don't distribute. I like that. Too much hype. True, of course. Network, insane complexity for small teams. That is, I think, a very important aspect here, that not everything has to be used by everybody, right? You could decide that it's a good thing for others, but not for you. That is actually possible. You don't have to do everything yourself. Okay, very nice. So a lot of things here. Let's go to the voting stage. Now you have your chance to add little +1s to the things that you think are Really nice. I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then we'll look at the result and see what the best arguments are. So if you're working on your anti-SPA career, your anti-microservices career, your anti-hype career, you have a good chance to find the right arguments to go to the next conference and talk about what's bad about microservices. Okay, here we are. Here are the results. Let's look at them. So this is a weird sorting here. It's in the reverse direction. So let's look down there. So, very good arguments. Lots of voting. Performance, lots of supporting infrastructure, complex infrastructure. Same argument twice here, right? Complexity. I think a lot of the things here should have been aggregated into single things, and complexity would be the number one issue here. Really nice. Thank you very much for this participation. Okay, Kubernetes, again, you mentioned it. So in case you don't know what Kubernetes is, it's a runtime environment for containerized applications, and it'll make sure that your application scales as if you were Google. I'm sorry for, again, oversimplifying so drastically. So why will Kubernetes users be mocked? What would be the argument why you never should have used that, and it should have been completely obvious, and nobody uses that anymore? Are you completely crazy? So why would they? Right. I mean, that's a good point. Maybe there is nothing bad about this thing, and that's not true, probably, right? There's something bad about everything, and there is, I can assure you, there are situations where Kubernetes is definitely overkill. But that does not mean it's bad technology, right? So it's not for small teams. It's huge complexity. Again, complexity is something we have here. Yagni, you ain't gonna need it. That is a good argument, possibly, because many people wish they had the problems that Kubernetes helps them solve, but they don't. So they add problems instead of solving problems by picking a technology that's way too complex, way too powerful what they have. It's like MS Word, only 5% of the features are used by most. That's probably true. It does not necessarily mean it's a completely bad product, but just that you should not be using it all the time, probably. Okay, so that's a very nice list as well. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, we could talk about other things, lots of other technologies. I forgot to put the title in here. So this is your open-ended question, but the idea was, again, what other hypes are current that we should be looking at to predict the future anti-hype cycles that will arrive here. So if you have anything that you think is overhyped at the moment, I think we talked about a lot of those things already. We mentioned blockchain. We mentioned a few of those here. We can probably reuse the answer from the slide before. So I'll just skip this particular question here. I like to, at the end, to get to a few other things, because I do think the hype curve is a nice part of the language that we use to describe things, but it also is sometimes not applicable. I've drawn this little could not care less curve because I do think there are technologies that are sort of hype resistant. They don't really care that much. Of course, they're more popular, less popular, but they sort of remain at a certain level, and that is, I think, perfectly okay. And I've tried to come up with a few examples. I will not bother you with answering all of those questions again, but let me just try to show you what kind of things I'm talking about. And the first one that I came up with is RDBMSs and SQL. I think SQL was invented, I may be wrong here, but I think it was in the 70s. And I think it really has stood the test of time. Now, of course, I'm aware of the NoSQL hype, and probably I could have added a NoSQL hype and anti-hype a slide set here as well, but I didn't. But I think RDBMSs got through this pretty nicely. They're still used in lots of places. It's perfectly fine to use them. Of course, they're not applicable for every situation. Of course not. There are great scenarios where you should be using other storage or database technologies. But still, in a lot of situations, a SQL database or a relational database system is a good choice. So I think this qualifies as one of the things that is sort of somewhat hype resistant. And the second one that I had in this vein was HTML and CSS. Now, I could have included JavaScript. Didn't want to get into the SPA discussion. I actually don't have anything against JavaScript. I do think, though, that these particular two technologies here have shown to be a good investment. So in terms of skills, right? If you invest in learning HTML, if you invest in learning CSS, that's very useful knowledge. HTML because really everybody should know it, and CSS because almost nobody does. So they're both important and both, I think, critical. They're also, I think, for very bad reasons, often viewed as not worthy of real developers or real architects' time, which I think is one of the stupidest things our industry has. This weird idea that they're not important. They're critically important, and you should absolutely spend time learning them, specifically, especially HTML. So in that regard, I'd like to maybe ask this last question: what are more things that stood the test of time? What do you think are more or less hype resistant, have now reached a level where talking about hype is no longer extremely useful? So please add your things here as well, and then I'll come to my final conclusion, and we can discuss whether or not any of what I said made any sense. So Java, I sort of expected people to do that. And I do think that it's kind of true. There was a lot of anti-Java feeling at one point in time when the Ruby on Rails stuff became extremely popular. And I do think we're now at a stage where a lot of other languages are perfectly fine as well. But I also think Java has shown a lot of resistance against being displaced by anything else. So it's a good thing. Same is probably true for C++, even though I think that's become a lot less popular in the last few years and is also still actively attacked by others. Object orientation is, I think, something that has remained here for a long time. It's a good argument. Architecture principles is one of my favorite things here, right? There are certain things that were true in the 60s and that are still true today. So those things are also good investments of your time and effort. Domain-driven design, I was unsure. I actually thought about adding that as one thing that is currently hyped, but I'm not sure. We could have that discussion maybe later on. TCP/IP, that is a good one. That definitely has stood the test of time, although today's TCP/IP is not your grandmother's TCP/IP anymore. There has been a lot of development there, but there still is a core that is a lot like what was created when the internet was invented. So very nice list. It'll be interesting to look into it in more detail later on, but we don't have the time right now. Thank you for mentioning REST. I would completely agree with that. Okay, so let me summarize what I wanted to get across in this session. So the first thing is that a hype-driven development, which is the idea that you just do something just because it is currently hyped, is a very risky approach, and you shouldn't be doing that. It's absolutely normal for something that is popular right now to have a lot of totally inflated expectations. The hype cycle curve is really correct there. So beware of that. Be very careful about those things. Adjust your expectations accordingly. Be skeptical. Don't go so far as to say this is all stupid, we should never be using it, but be aware of the limitations. The second thing is anti-hype is hype too, right? So, I mean, it's nice to claim that you're a skeptic and that you're critical and this is just old stuff being sold in new clothes. That's sometimes true, but people are serving their own self-interest possibly as well. So that is just a fact of life. You should aim for, of course, the sort of middle ground, which is what I would like to leave you with as my final message. Whether or not something is fashionable is the least important aspect, right? That is not what should be driving your decisions. What you should be doing is add stuff to your tool set continuously, add new things, figure out when they're usable, how you can apply them and when you should apply them, and then move on with that. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for participating so nicely in all of this. And with that, I'll stop my presentation and hand over for a final Q&A. Thank you. So, Carola.
Yes, thank you very much, Stefan. I saw that I think there were two questions even in AHA, but we start with the questions from Hopper now. And the first one is, which Hive curve would you say small talk falls into? I still remember small talk.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, so I'm not going to I'm not going to go back to that slide, but I have that one with that sad decline to irrelevance, which I think is very, very sadly the case for Smalltalk. I would love to say that it has reached the plateau of productivity. Sadly, it hasn't. I know that I'm hurting some Smalltalk enthusiasts' feelings here. I'm aware of Faro and of fantastic work by Tudor Gerber and his team, for example, with their graphical toolkit. There are fantastic things still happening in the Smalltalk community, but most people don't care, which I think is very, very sad. I think Smalltalk was a fantastic language, fantastic environment. I never worked with it professionally, but I always was interested. I would have loved to, but back then I had to use C++. So a very sad situation. I do think that a lot of the ideas that were invented in the Smalltalk community still survive today, and a lot of technology does as well, right? So the VMs that we have for Java, for example, are based on Smalltalk VMs. A lot of the object-oriented patterns that we use today were invented in the Smalltalk world. A lot of interesting thoughts that people still have these days about systems being modifiable at runtime were originally invented in the Smalltalk world. So I find it sad that it had this history, but maybe the fact that it still is so well regarded after all this time, and that so many of its ideas still survive. Refactoring, I mean, so many things is kind of awesome. But still sad.
That's true. I'm totally agreeing with you. That's the second question goes somehow in the same way. Is there a reason why you didn't mention CRC cards?
I love CRC cards. In fact, this idea, it's a fantastic approach to figure out how to distribute responsibility among different participants or modules or services or whatever it is, right? So that's a very cool aspect. I think this particular method just is no longer on anybody's radar, but that doesn't mean that the idea is good. And so far, yes, I absolutely could have mentioned that as one of the things, but there are so many things that I didn't mention. I mean, there are so many hypes or former hypes that have still interesting things to contribute to today's work.
Yes, we really use them as well still. So the next question is a very long one. How would you discern between technologies that may be worth trying during the hype phase versus the ones that are not worth it? In other words, sometimes hypes pay off. You gave a bit of an answer before, but maybe it's good to discuss it again.
Right. So, I mean, it's complicated, but I don't think that's something being hyped and being fashionable means it's bad. Of course not. I mean, sometimes fashionable things can be good too, right? For example, I do think there is a lot of benefit in microservices. In fact, I have another presentation where I have patterns and anti-patterns, and I have microservices twice. It has an entry in both categories because it's absolutely true, right? Microservices can be a fantastic pattern, and they can be a horrible anti-pattern. It really depends on your context. As with any pattern, it depends on your context, right? So I think it's very rare that something becomes hyped without any reason at all. It happens, but in general, let me one example would be, what do you call this robotic automation? Always forget the acronym. Robot automation, whatever. This weird idea of driving applications with scripts that are then called robot. That is just stupid. I mean, sometimes things are just stupid without no doubt about it. But most of the time, there is some core thing that is interesting and that might be just the solution you're looking for. So probably the answer to that question is it's never true for something without context. It's never true for anything in isolation that it's worth being looked into. The context matters, but it might be that the context is learning, and maybe it's different. But if you're applying it to your work life, then probably you have some sort of problems and you don't have other sorts of problems. So unless you're looking to change your job, you're probably looking for the stuff that matches your needs.
Yes, perfect. And there is another one that goes into the same direction. What's about AI and NLP? Are they a hype? Will they remain? I mean, the question is, what's your opinion about those?
It's a good point. So I think they should probably be separated. But if we're talking about what's called AI today, probably more ML, or I don't know, then I think that is definitely a hype, sometimes somewhat ridiculous hype, which is not at all, I don't at all mean to imply that this is not a good technology or not worth pursuing. It absolutely is. And I think it is a great addition to people's tools. But when I read something that traditional programming will no longer be done 5 years from now because 90% of the systems will be built by ML systems, that's just that's almost boringly wrong. And I think ML capabilities are completely unnecessarily oversold all the time. They're absolutely impressive. I'm really impressed by the things we have achieved these days. And I do think there's like 5% of use cases where this is absolutely insanely great, and where I could not imagine finding any other solution, which still leaves 95% of the things where all the other technologies and techniques are meaningful and useful still. So I don't think we have to worry about our jobs because of that. And of course, I think if it interests you, then you should spend time with that stuff. But I do think we're a long cry away from actual intelligence in systems, which is why I'm still highly skeptical of, self-driving cars and, actual anything comparable to actual intelligence. Grady Booch, who was one of the original architect gurus, is very active on Twitter and maintains a fantastic list of criticisms of, or often criticizes AI and ML overhyped.
Yeah, true.
Statements.
I enjoy his feed as well. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. There are some more questions. The next one is, do you see a different hype cycle between agile development and classic development? This is a good one.
That's also a very good question, right? So I think that agile development has sort of, on the one hand, become a little mainstream, and it's sort of in this boring stage now, right? Because most people are doing it without talking about it a lot. Maybe this is a different category. I think the biggest risk here is the fake agile movement, if you can call it that, or the fact that many people claim to be doing agile development when what they're doing is really something completely different. And I'm not sure that fits into the hype cycle somewhere. Maybe that's another curve that one should be drawing. I don't know. And it would be interesting to see how bad it is when people claim to be doing something and thus ruin its reputation because what they're doing is something completely wrong, or whether that's just a no true Scotsman fallacy of some kind. But I would have to put more thought into that particular.
It's as well. It's not a technology, no.
That's also true.
Process.
So maybe that's why it follows a different hype cycle. Possibly, I don't know. Would be interesting.
Okay, we have to think about that. The person who put the question in can discuss with us later. And the last question that we have here for this morning: would you agree that if something is fashionable, you find easier employees for your company?
Yes, but they may not be the employees that you want.
Perfect. Yes. Because there are people following the hype, aren't they?
Well, that's true. I mean, if that's the reason, if they follow fashion, then I don't know. Yeah. Maybe they should be in the fashion industry. Maybe we all are.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I hope all of you enjoyed the discussion on Hop, and there might be some more questions. I actually don't know.
There are also some more in the slides, and I'll try to answer a few of them if I can somehow. Thank you for participation. Okay. Thank you, Carola, for asking.
Thank you very much.